So throughout my presentation, I've included quotes from articles and excerpts from an oral history interview with a man named Feivel Simkin. And rather than reading the quotes out loud, I thought it might be more engaging for you all to read them for yourselves as I'm speaking, if you'd like. One of our readings for today is called Winnipeg's Jewish Social Welfare Institutions. In this paper, the author Arthur Ross makes mention 9 times to a newspaper called the Israelite Press, which was founded in 1911. In the particular quote I've included at the top of this slide, Arthur Ross suggests that the Israelite Press had a part to play in encouraging doctors to get involved in volunteering with the Jewish social welfare institution called the Mount Carmel Clinic. Before reading Arthur Ross's article, I had intended to do my presentation on the involvement of Winnipeg's Jewish community in the left-wing politics in the early 20th century, as it's a topic that I've been interested in for about 4 years now. I was glad to see so many mentions by Arthur Ross to the Israelite Press, as I feel it allows me to bridge my pre-existing interests to the course content in a relevant way. As I hope to show you, Feivel Simkin is a very interesting person, and I believe that getting to know his story is actually an effective way of understanding the ways in which Winnipeg's Jewish community in general engaged with left-wing politics in the early 20th century. In his oral history interview with Roz Siskin, Feivel Simkin shares that he was born in Russia in 1885. At that time, Feivel lived with his family under the Tsar and said that conditions were not good. For example, despite the fact that those involved in a revolution in 1905 were promised amnesty, Feivel recalls that at night police came and many were shot. From what I've read, it seems likely that his experience under such a repressive government contributed to his lifelong interest in anti-authoritarian political movements. In his youth, Feivel Simkin was involved with young Bundists in Russia. According to Simkin, the Bund acted like a trade union to the extent that it tried to get better conditions for Jewish workers in factories and stores, but its main focus was on political activities. To quote Simkin, "That was the main thing, to be against the government." The Bund was an underground movement which Simkin recounted would hold meetings in schools because authorities wouldn't think to look there, as schools were considered kosher. The Bund also held meetings in the forest. And in order to hold these meetings secretly, Feivel's group placed lookouts to guide members to the meeting grounds. Simkin recounted that members of the group would come one by one so that the police wouldn't know. Feivel's involvement in the Bund does not seem to have stopped when he joined the military and seems in part to have driven him to run away after 9 months of service. As Feivel received a tip that the authorities were about to arrest 300 men, he and 12 others ran away. He achieved this by having his family send a false telegram stating that his mother was ill, which allowed him to be granted leave. Feivel would never return to the army, and instead, he went to visit his father's family in Barishev. There he borrowed a passport from his friend, who was illiterate, and he used this passport to visit a brother in Pavelgrad for 8 months, where he met some other Bundists. According to Feivel, that's what happened before I came to Winnipeg. In Barishev, when he was 15 years old, Feivel worked in a print shop of a match factory doing the covers for the matches, which he considers as the beginning of his printing career. Feivel fully grew into his own as a printer after arriving in Winnipeg, as in 1911 he and his friend Louis Orlico started the Israelite Press after purchasing a failed socialist newspaper operation entitled the Winnipeg Courier. As shown in this extract, Feivel's radical Bundist politics prepared him to eventually be sympathetic to anarchist politics when he arrived in Winnipeg. While anarchism is a loaded term which can understandably invoke images of chaos and violence, the quote here from Maria Chomard is helpful in understanding that in some significant ways, anarchism has been mischaracterized. While Feivel Simkin's earlier simple description of anarchism as being about educating yourself and then getting along without government, and while this is a valid description, the formal etymology of anarchism comes from the Greek words an and archos, which taken together mean without rulers. Anarchist theory advances the idea that a society can operate without major imbalances of power while still being functional and organized. Anarchist theory often refers to imbalances in power as hierarchies, some examples being gendered, racial, and class hierarchies. The anarchist point of view is a socialist point of view, and while communism is also a socialist point of view, one of the central differences has to do with the question of hierarchy. Many communist societies were very hierarchical, which is something that anarchists such as Feivel Simkin criticize. As shown by these quotes from Maria Chomard, despite the differences in opinion expressed by anarchist socialists such as Feivel Simkin regarding communist socialists, left-wing Jewish progressives in Winnipeg in the early 20th century were still very capable of working together. As this excerpt demonstrates, despite his earlier characterization of communists as Oisvorfs and Meshugoyim, the fact that his wife was a communist didn't cause any difficulties in Feivel's marriage. In her article, Maria Chomard suggests that one factor which led to the acceptance of diverse political tendencies within the Jewish community in Winnipeg at the time was the fact that many of the groups shared resources such as meeting spaces. One meeting space, which was of particular importance to the left wing of Winnipeg's Jewish community in the early 20th century, was the Liberty Temple, also known as the Freiheit Temple, located at the corner of Pritchard Avenue and Salter Street, and pictured above. In 1914, Feivel Simkin was involved in the establishment of a parrot school, which was housed in the Liberty Temple. According to Maria Chomard, the schools were named after the Yiddish language author and playwright Isaac Lieb Peretz. In 2019, some friends of mine and I led a tour of significant historical areas within Winnipeg at the time of the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike, and I presented for 10 minutes on the Liberty Temple, where this photo was taken. Though I'm told it's the same building as the one which would have housed the schools that Feivel Simkin was involved with, I believe it's now used for residential purposes, and I'm not sure when it stopped belonging to the Jewish community. The graffiti on the building is a little bit emblematic of the urban decline which has taken place in Winnipeg in the last 100 years. In addition to parrot schools, Jewish anarchists were involved in establishing the Arbeiter Ring School. Arbeiter Ring means workers' circle. I like this excerpt from the Simkin interview because it has a very live and let live type of vibe. Simkin says repeatedly in his oral history interview that education was very important to him because he never got any when he was young. In the Arthur Ross reading for today's class, he discusses how communal charity and mutual aid were taken up by emerging secular Jewish social welfare institutions, notably the Hebrew Sick Benefit Association, the Mount Carmel Hospital, Free Loan Societies, the Jewish Orphanage, and the Old Folks Home. One question I had is, why did Winnipeg's far-left Jewish activists not support the more elite charities of the time? It's not exactly clear to me why Winnipeg's far-left Jewish activists didn't support the more elite charities of the time, but I thought that Feivel Simkin's explanation was funny because it seems as if he's offended by a comment made about fish. I wish the transcript of the interview did more to explain what was meant by that comment and how he interpreted it. Maria Chomard offers a more matter-of-fact explanation, which seemed to suggest it was just a matter of having different priorities. Maria writes, quote, "The priority of Winnipeg's Jewish anarchist community was to propagate ideas among workers, thus promoting their relief work." Last year I took 2 classes on Indigenous ways of knowing that I really liked, one of which was called Anishinaabe Field School and another of which was called Indigenous Perspectives Decolonizing Health Research. Because of what I learned in these classes, I feel it's important to share my personal connection to research that I do when it's possible. The person who conducted the oral history interview with Feivel Simkin is named Roz Usiskin. Roz Usiskin was a major force in Winnipeg with regard to history as well as left-wing politics, and she passed away this November. In 2020, I wrote an article for a left-wing magazine called Canadian Dimension about the Arbeiter Ring and Parrot schools at the Liberty Temple, and was able to interview Roz for my article. Given that she interviewed Feivel Simkin and that I interviewed her, I feel that in a way there's a link between me and Feivel Simkin, even though he was born in 1885 and I was born in 1992. Even though this link is pretty thin, I still think it's cool and wanted to share that because it connects me personally to this research. In my presentations, I've attempted to give a survey of some left-wing politics such as Bundism, anarchism, and communism at play within the Jewish community in Winnipeg in the early 20th century. The main focal point for this survey has been Feivel Simkin. Through my own personal life experiences, several years ago I developed an interest in anarchism. In my presentation, I hope if nothing else, you may have found it interesting to learn that such a political ideology was present within the Jewish community at one point in time. Thank you.